Hello, welcome to Lecture 2 of Psych 221, Psychology Applied to Work. Lecture 2 is the history of IO psychology. Because this is the history portion, I have added a aged orange squiggle to our PowerPoint slides to represent something, I guess, tattered and torn among the choices that PowerPoint gives you. And please enjoy it, because this is the only lecture where you'll get the orange squiggle. Okay, with all of these lectures, I like to do bookends. I like to tell you what I'm going to talk about, and then I like to tell you what I talked about at the end. And then the next lecture, I spend a moment to talk about what we talked about last time. And that's just the repetition, and repetition is good for locking down your associations and helping you remember. So if you're binging this will be really irritating, but if you took a day or two in between, this will be a good memory. So in lecture 1 we went through basically the syllabus and sort of high level conversation about each one of the lectures, and then we talked, and that included talking about myself a little bit. We went through the sequence of things, and then we got into IO psychology in terms of what it is, and we talked a little bit about what kind of careers are available in the field. We talked about many different types of challenges that IO psychology is either trying to address or just that IO psychologists face in the field. And then we talked in general about the other aspects of psychology and why they're relevant to the workplace. Well, today we are going to talk about the history. How did we get here? It will start with the early years, and that's early, roughly speaking, the majority of the early years that are relevant here is early 20th century. And among other things, it was really about efficiency, scientific management. And that led into World War I, where selection and tests and so forth. This is mostly industrial psychology. And then the 1920s and 30s, the famous Hawthorne experiments and the Hawthorne effect, which is probably the most famous sort of effect or named thing that people talk about in psychology that can be attributed to IO psychology. And in World War II and sort of the dawn of human factors engineering, and then all the change that happened in the post-war, the dramatic growth in the other domains of psychology, continued growth in IO psychology, and the postmodern era, computers, the generations growing up, dramatic growth in IO, changes in business models, but really the information revolution and what a dramatic effect that had on business and culture. And then we ended with talking about kind of where we are right now, which is just everything changing. A lot of things right now feeling like they're in upheaval. And the whole time we'll talk about how IO psychology has adapted, what their contributions were, and just sort of the changing landscape. If you recall, one of the challenges, a whole slide on the challenges of IO psychology from the last lecture was just about the moving target that is our culture and our business processes, our organizational models, and all of that entanglement. And when IO psychology, as an applied, as a practice, is trying to help that area, it keeps changing. Okay, and then after this lecture 3, we're going to have a bonus lecture, and that's the human animal at work. Okay, so history. Before we get into the history of IO psychology, I do want to ground you a little bit, or give you some healthy skepticism that I would suggest you employ anytime you're looking at history. In fact, anytime you're looking at anyone telling you a story about what happened whether it's the news talking about, what happened today, or your history book saying what happened centuries ago. So first of all, history is a kind of fiction, in a way. It's a story that we create. And we create in order to tell ourselves, how we got to where we are right now. So anybody that's actually writing history cannot help but do it from the perspective of whoever they are and where they are right now. And the reason we like history, the reason we are dependent upon it, whether it's officially a history book or just family stories, or old folk tales, and why do we keep sharing them? I mean, obviously, as a species, we're very gossipy. We dedicate a massive amount of our non-productive time basically to social gossip. Huge parts of our brain seem to be around the group regulatory mechanisms that stuff we would call gossip is. But why do we feel drawn to these stories? And one is obviously the lessons. So it's sort of vicariously learning through the experiences of others, and that's really a huge part of the power of story. And that's true. You learn about the person that got bit by the snake when they walked by the certain patch of berries on the trail from the village to the watering hole, and then you're careful, and so that you don't get bit by a snake. And so certainly those sorts of lessons apply for why we like to tell stories. But every bit as critical is the fact that the story of how we got here is essential for telling us where we're going. So you can't really decide, what should you do, whether what should your career be, or as a village, should you enter into a trade agreement with a neighboring tribe? Should you send out a hunting party? Whatever. I'm going way back into ancient times. But anytime we're looking at decision points about what we should do in the future, what we usually do is play it out, right? We trying to make a decision. What should we do? What should I do? And you play it forward. Well, you don't play it from here, okay? You don't play it from now, because what is now? Now is actually the story you tell yourself, where you believe you're at, and where you believe you're going, and what sort of narrative momentum do you have? So you can't all of the things that we take for granted that other people will also take for granted, like culture, that is actually built around all of our stories. So I mean, I could talk for way too long about this, but and this might not get through to you, but I really hope it does. That we make our future decisions within a framework where we picture ourselves or our groups or whatever the thing that's deciding is. We picture it on a trajectory, and that trajectory is the past. And the story of what's happened is also like the rules of what life is like. And then we use that sort of model. And you could think of that story of the past as like a simulation or a game or whatever, but it's like the rules. And then we take our decision point and we play out different options, route B, route C, or whatever. And we take sort of the rules of our memories, rules of what we think the world is, which is all based on our stories of really how we got here. We apply that forward. And then we try to figure out which is the decision that we think plays out the best for whatever things we're trying to decide about, and then we move forward and hopefully we make a good decision. But without that story we have of who we are and what is this world, we don't have a thing to run a simulation on, so to speak. about our decisions and to try to pick the right one. So we have to have a history, whether we call it a history book or not. We take it for granted, but it's really the who are we and how will we act. If you want to decide whether to walk out onto a road on a busy street and you decide not to because you'll get hit by a car, that's because you know through history, through your past, through your experience, how cars will behave on roads. And so you can't get away from the need for the narrative that tells you where you're at. Okay, so that's a little abstract, but it's actually important if we're going to talk about history. So history is a story. And in some ways, you can to say it's a kind of fiction, or that history is fiction, is sort of a jarring way to get you to think about it again. Is not necessarily the thing that happened. It's the story that is the sort of the most useful thing that we all sort of believe, that tells us where we're at. But one of the ways that this shows up to be true is how often we're rewriting our history. Or deciding to tell the story differently, because some things happened in these decisions we make of the future. Some things happen in the encounters we have in our futures, okay, that don't play out the way we expected, and then that tells us, hey, maybe we aren't where we thought we were. Maybe we haven't been where we thought we were. And then we have to rewrite that history so that where we are now makes sense. And then hopefully, as we make decisions moving forward, we don't run into those problems. So it's really, it's a fundamental concept that if you grasp it, you see it everywhere. When we talk about history, and we're about to go into some basic slides, where we talk about people and events in the past. So the events, I mean, they tend to be factual. There's a lot of physical evidence that there was a big battle at Gettysburg. But the fiction part, or the story part, is typically the lines we draw, and which events we choose to include, and which events we choose to leave out. So when we draw causal arrows between events, we're basically ignoring the infinite number of other possible causal arrows that led to one event and another event, and we write a narrative through it, and we can't help it because it's the way we think. It's the way our brains evolved. We are beings with brains, and our brains have evolved to move our bodies in space. And everything about us is really about moving in space. And the way we think is a metaphorical form of moving in space. So that's why we have linear narratives. It's why we tell stories, and it's why we have causal arrows. But it's a fundamental limitation of our brains. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more in the bonus lectures, and I don't want to derail this lecture too much. But this is really fundamental, and we're going to hit it a bunch of times in the bonus lectures, and hopefully you get some aha moments about it. To give you like an example of this, here are a number of books, and they are all history books about the United States. This is a college textbook for a history, like a History 103. This would be a similar textbook if you took U.S. history at NDSU. Well, this is another history book called The People's History of the United States. It's about, I think it's 40 years old. It is considered a classic, and some people love it, and some people absolutely hate it. It's considered deeply ideological, or for some people, it's the most true story of the United States, because this is telling the story of factory workers and other marginalized folks, the working poor, African Americans, Native Americans, and that this is the history. Well, then you get sort of reactions to that. So you have the Patriots' History of the United States, which is, I haven't read this. I mean, it's pretty thick, and I have a lot of books. I've read a little of this, and I get the sense for it, and this has been incredibly influential to lots of other books. But so I don't want to misrepresent the book, but from what I've looked at, these are sort of counter narratives. and they'll have some cases like the same events they talk about, but each one is actually viewing it differently because they're drawing different causal arrows and bringing in different events, and then they're telling a different story. And so you can't help but choose which events are included in your history, and you can't help but tell this quasi-linear narrative. And it's in that process of picking what matters. So you just talk about, I don't know, Paul Revere, but then you actually want to talk about the story of a slave and how that at the exact same time that the Paul Revere event was happening. So you're making a value judgment, and then that actually, and I'm not personally trying to make any commentary about any of these books. I'm trying to point out the differences, and that a history is inevitably an assertion of values. It inevitably needs a value framework to choose which events to include, and it's really in the exclusion of the millions of other possible events that you're saying aren't part of the story that matters. It's in that process that you're crafting the narrative that's telling you where you're at or who you are or who this country is, and by crafting that narrative, that's sort of like locking in the world of the game. That's like defining the simulation you're in, sort of. And so then, if you accept that, like this is the story, this is what happened, well, then the United States is an oppressive place, and we have to keep working at undoing those systems, and we have to make the world a better place for people that weren't included in the game. Or if you just read this book, you might come back with, this is the greatest place ever, and we have to fight as though our lives depended upon it. To keep anyone from tearing it down. So these really fundamentally affect your future decisions. So history is a story, and it's a story you tell based on your values framework. And then you get stuff like this, the Renegade History of the United States. This is actually an interesting, it's a fun book. And this is essentially stating that the original culture of the United States was a bunch of Puritans and Calvinists and really boring people that just wanted to work all the time and wanted life to be suffering so that you would earn your way in heaven. But yet a number of immigrants that came in and slaves at the time were not having that, and they were saying, I want today to be kind of fun, and I don't want to go through my whole life having it being just terribly boring and toil. And then it's in that interplay, that tension that actually has changed our culture over the centuries and made us more of a fun, dancing, live in the moment, plus work hard and think towards the future. Anyway, the point of all of this is that history is a story you tell to understand where you're at so that you make a decision moving forward. So a little bit of a bonus lecture tangent there for you, but if you forget everything else, it's not that important. The names of for an introductory IO psychology, it's not that important that you remember specific names for these coming slides. But if you do remember some element of what I was just talking about, that would be very good for your future, in my opinion. So this is history. Proceed with skepticism. Okay. Wilhelm Wundt. I'm bad with pronunciations and German pronunciations. We'll start with one of the founders of modern psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, because he's a nice crossover point between the broader domain of psychology and where IO psychology was born. Wilhelm Wundt was the first. He created the first experimental laboratory. Really, the thing that psychology is a science. We have labs. We do experiments, and then he trained an individual named Münsterberg and an individual named Scott, and their arguably the fathers, the founders of IO psychology. Now, Hugo Münsterberg, he he was a founding member of the APA. He was also, besides being a founder of IO psychology, he was also he's also been called the father of forensic psychology, and some have even called him the father or founder of psychotherapy or clinical psychology. So hugely influential. And he came to America, and Scott came back to America, and most of IO psychology was established in the United States. But they trace their academic lineage to Wilhelm Wundt. So IO psychology branched off of a true founder of the domain of psychology. Münsterberg was an interesting fellow. He was actually accused of being a German spy. He focused on applying applied psychology, and looked at workplace efficiency, and applying testing to employee selection. And he wrote the first IO psychology book. So, in this, we'll talk about a thing called Taylorism in scientific management in the next slide. But this book, among many other things, sort of brings looks at an engineering approach to the workforce, and then looks at it from a psychological lens. It's fun to get actually the original books and start looking at the writing at the time to give you a flavor of things. I'm tempted to actually read passages, but I don't think, I think I might be the only one that would like that. Okay, so Scott, Walter Scott, is the other person generally considered the founder of IO psychology. The explicit development of IO psychology. Some people argue that Scott is more than Münsterberg, and people could argue the other way. It doesn't matter. I don't have an opinion on the matter. Walter Scott wrote a number of books around things like advertising and applying consumer, what would now be consumer psychology. Some of these are kind of fun. A series of bisected lines, which bisection is the most pleasing. Let's get focus here. And then he did a bunch of stuff in here. Is a square or a rectangle more pleasing? And then he kind of critiques from a psychological perspective a bunch of advertisement at the time. And this is actually a fun old book because you get the Howard obesity ointment. This is on diseased lungs, Dr. Bull's cough syrup. This is a 1913 book. The first book on advertising was 1903. Scott didn't just look at advertisement. He was also involved in selecting and managing employees. So Münsterberg and Scott are sort of the giants in the field, and they were both sort of raised under Wundt. So there's a good pedigree, so to speak, to IO psychology. Taylor. Frederick Winslow Taylor, he was not a psychologist. He was the founder of scientific management. And scientific management is massively influential. And many things that we now take for granted were birthed by Taylor and people that carried on his viewpoint and his methods. He looked at the workplace, with an engineer's mind, with clockwork precision, somewhat of a view of people are somewhat interchangeable. I mean, not that everybody's suitable for the same job, because one of the things he did is actually looked at suitability, but it's about like making an orderly process, and making sure that, you know, factories, for instance, you know, run exceptionally efficiently. So Taylorism is a term used, but scientific management probably has had more legs in terms of use. So every job should be analyzed and optimized. It isn't necessarily the worker that actually knows. He did a famous thing on coal shoveling, you know, where he broke down the task and looked at all sorts of different shovels and looked at different shoveling techniques, and where how your back is bent and your legs are bent and the movement. And then he looked at different amounts of weight, and he created curves and determined, you know, there's an optimal weight of coal, an optimal technique, and supposedly like tripled the productivity output of a coal shoveler. Well, I mean, at the time when things were running on steam power, and very few things were, you know, automated, dudes shoveling coal was like the engine that kept everything going. And I mean, it was mostly dudes, turning that into a science and getting a tripling of output of how fast you can shovel coal, and presumably if a tripling was accomplished without increasing fatigue and that sort of thing. I mean, that's a big deal to the costs of a business and how many people you need shoveling coal. Certainly the coal shoveling wasn't the only thing he looked at. Scientific management was and remains hugely influential. And while he wasn't a psychologist, folks like Munsterberg sort of translated and brought other things to bear. And so Taylorism and Taylor is definitely considered to be part of biopsychology. Yeah, he looked at, there was a time with unions that were more guild-like, where nepotism was extremely common. Like you had your job and you always made sure that your son got the job, or your cousin or a friend. And one of the things that Taylorism did is pushed against that, and basically said that the people that are actually fit for the job should get the job. Obviously that wasn't something that everybody liked. And yeah, the Taylorism was and remains hugely influential. Oh, I love these pictures. So back in the day, the cameras, the film took a long time to develop. So all these old pics, sometimes people had to sit there for tens and tens of seconds or longer, and so, you know, people can't hold smiles that long, and so all the sort of captured pics at the time have all these dour expressions on people's faces. I suspect that a number of these people smiled a lot, just not when they're getting their photographs taken. So the Gilbreths, Lillian and Frank, and then if you look at the years there, Lillian went on, lived on like almost 50 years, more than Frank. So she ended up being, her and her husband were people that took Taylorism and grew it substantially and added to it quite a bit. But Lillian went on to be very influential in American businesses, continuing to apply scientific management principles and doing things like inventing efficiency improving products and making changes in how appliances were designed and that sort of thing. So Lillian Gilbreth was a huge pioneer and she was an industrial engineer along with her husband, but she went on to actually get a PhD in applied psychology. It's generally not considered the first PhD in IO psychology, I assume, because it probably wasn't formally called IO psychology, but it was applied psychology, and she was looking at, I think, teaching methods. But it's pretty close. The first IO psychology PhD is generally credited to somebody that we'll talk about in the next slide. But she's a fascinating figure. She had all sorts of kids. A couple of her kids actually wrote a book called Cheaper by the Dozen about their life growing up, and she developed a number of things. So she was the inventor of the foot pedal trash can. Working with appliance companies, she was I guess the first person to put shelves in refrigerator doors. You think about that. Somebody had to actually stop and go, hey, you got room here. And instead of always reaching back all the time, you could actually put a little shelf in here for easy to reach common use items. And then the kitchen work triangle, the whole, this is where the stove is, this is where the fridge is, this is where the sink is, and you'd be more productive if you put that in a triangular shape around the kitchen. So Taylor had massive influence on business and business processes and industry. Lillian Gilbreth also had a massive influence. And then Mary Parker, I think it's Follett. I hope I'm not butchering these. There's those pictures again. You think that I want to see the ones where they tried to smile for like the full minute or whatever it took. What maybe it ends up being blurry around the corner because it's just so hard to keep those smiles. Some have called her the mother of modern management. So you can think of Follett as sort of a counterpoint to Taylorism, not necessarily like a refutation or a alternative, but more of a okay, yeah, we should get. It's good to get sciencey about how to run a factory. It's good to get stopwatches out. And I should say that one of the big things that Taylorism did was time studies, and one of the big things that the Gilbreths are known for is motion studies and fatigue and sort of progenitors of what would now be considered like ergonomics and that sort of thing. Mary Follett, she looked at more of the O than the I, more of the organization side and less of the industrial side, which is really, one way to look at that is more the human side versus the regimented efficiency side. So the I in industrial and organizational psychology is often like the psychometric part, the testing part, the sort of specific processes that are optimal in the workplace. And the O side is the human interaction side or the social side, and in some cases there's things that blur the line between an I-O, but it's a definition that generally still applies today. And you could think of Mary Follett as the O that was introduced to balance some of the I. So she was an organizational theorist. So she would push back against the Taylorism approach, and that you can't always have a regimented process, that you have to recognize that you got to have informal processes, that yes, you have hierarchies, but there's networks within those hierarchies, and people understand how to navigate those things, and you shouldn't try to stop informal processes. In fact, you shouldn't ignore them. You should actually lean on them, and you could get more from your company or organization. And then it looked at like power structures, and she was an advocate of power with instead of power over, and talked about reciprocal relationships. So instead of like a top-down command-driven, my boss told me that we will do X, and now I'm telling you to go and implement X, more of a collaborative approach is better. And so that an effective leader is somebody that actually harnesses the power of the group instead of becomes, incredibly charismatically or command or driven, powerful themselves. That having a little bit of healthy conflict, which is to say giving people some agency and letting things get brought up and allowing a little bit of pushback. Up the chain and laterally could be a really good thing if it's done constructively, if it's done where people are trying to get a win-win. And then you come to a resolution through what you would call integration, which it would be something like a compromise, but basically something that takes into account everybody's viewpoint, and looks for the most successful path forward for everybody involved. So just the human side of things, all of these are, none of this should seem earth-shattering to somebody right now, because these approaches have all been adopted. You know, scientific management is all over the place, not by name, but the notion that you should be able to quantify, the notion that you should establish metrics to processes, that's everywhere. And of course, accounting is itself a big measure. But also the notion that people are complicated, and people don't like to just be cogs in machines, and people like agency, and people like mastery. People like to be good at something, and people like to have a say in something. It gives them meaning, and the combination of both the Taylorism, you know, with the Follettism. People don't call it that, but you understand what I'm saying. That's really the balance that's needed to both create an orderly structure, as well as something that really harnesses more of the full power of people. Okay, so coordination and harmony over compulsion. All right, well, World War I came around, and the U.S. Army suddenly needed to bring in like 1 million soldiers really, really fast, and they needed ways of sorting and selecting. How do we know which ones are destined to be able to make command decisions, which ones you know, really should be working behind the lines or the front lines, those sorts of things. So very quickly, psychologists were developing evaluation tests, and a man named Robert Yerkes, who I think became president of the APA at some point, developed alpha and beta, and they were essentially intelligence tests adopted from the famous Stanford-Binet intelligence tests. And so these were group administrated tests. So alpha was given to people who could read, and beta was given to people who couldn't. So the U.S. in this early 1900s, you know, with a lot of large immigrant population, a lot of first generation people that didn't speak English that well, and certainly couldn't read, and certainly some, you know, U.S. born folks were also illiterate too. But it was, you know, group administered intelligence tests essentially, and it became something that the U.S. military absolutely counted on, and it's evolved immensely over the years. But you know, assessment of cognitive abilities of troops is something that is probably done by every modern army on the planet. And then there were some other things like the Woodworth personal data sheet. So this was, you know, neurotic tendencies. I mean, this was really looking at could we figure out a way to sift through these recruits and see which ones are more likely to get shell shock, which would now be called PTSD. But you know, can we figure out a way to determine you know, who could be resilient to that sort of thing? And then how do you determine who could be an officer? And then, you know, there weren't that many airplanes, but there were some, so they had some pilot selection. It's really the beginning of the testing movement in the United States, and it started being adopted into the business world. And then 1920s and 30s, or the interwar periods, the most famous IO psychology studies occurred, and those were the Hawthorne studies, and that was looking at workforce efficiency as a result of changes in the workplace. So if you turn up the lights, you know, if you change the temperature, you know, if you change the working environment, do workers get more productive or less? And this was involved Harvard University. Elton Mayo is generally credited as the lead there, and then the Western Electric Company. It was done at the Hawthorne Works plant in Cicero, Illinois. So this isn't called the Elton Mayo studies. It gets named after the factory. And then the Hawthorne effect is something people talk about today, and it's certainly something people are cognizant about that are doing any kind of experiments with people, where the people know that there's an experiment underway. And it's in the case of the Hawthorne effect for the Hawthorne studies, it was about changes in the workplace environment, and that so they would do a changed environment, like increase the lighting, and then productivity would go up. And then, all right, good, let's keep the lighting this way. And then sometime later, long after the experiments, the productivity would go back down. So they'd come in and they would turn the lights down and a little, and the worker productivity would go up. And then they'd go away for a while, and the productivity would return. And eventually, what they tumbled to was, whenever we make a change, so just any change makes productivity get better. And as well, it's observation. It's change in observation. So when people know that they're being watched, they change their behavior. And that's the Hawthorne effect can be thought of broader than that, but that's probably the shortest version of it. Is when people know that there's an observation underway, there's a metacognition involved where people are paying attention to themselves and they behave differently. And so, increasing attention on workers changed the behavior of the workers, and hence the Hawthorne effect. So, any novel change can bring about a behavior change, and then observation. So participants behave differently if they know they're in a study. Some of the other things that came out of the Hawthorne effect was talking about the importance of the social side of things. That working conditions certainly affect human behavior, but what's the social context? What's the attitude of the people? How motivated are they? All these things matter. So this is not like a full refutation of Taylorism again, but it's kind of like Follett's ad. It's, hey, there's more stuff we've got to pay attention here. This is largely additive. That they're different leadership styles affect things differently. This is really part of the springboard of the organizational side again, the Hawthorne studies and Mary Follett's work, and other people that I didn't mention, people like Henry Dennison and Walter Lewin, and I'm sure piles of others that pushed the importance of the social side of things, the importance of nuance, the importance of individual motivational levels, and that sort of thing. And this is often heralded, the putting the O in IO is credited with the human relations era. So you might say before that was the scientific management era, and after that it was the human relations era. It's not that clean, but it's a decent way of looking at it. Again, this is history. So we're just telling a story. We're just telling a linear narrative to tell us where we got here. It's obviously a lot more complicated. There's a lot of other things going on. So as long as you're mildly skeptical, this is still a useful narrative to tell us, where we are in IO psychology today. And that's where this whole lecture is leading to, is eventually get to today. Like any social sciences experiment from a long time ago, it gets criticized. The robustness of statistics was not employed, and people certainly criticize that this is more anecdote than science. But a number of things in here have stood the test of time, at least from a business practice standpoint. Okay, World War II happened, and World War II was quite large, multi-year, and there were 2,000 psychologists got pulled into the war effort. An evolution of classification tests for recruits, alpha and beta, were replaced by more sophisticated tests, more training techniques. But the important part of World War II was the birth of engineering psychology, the turning human factors engineering into something that you could be treated somewhat like an engineering problem to solve. You had a whole bunch of sophisticated machinery coming online. You had you had radar and electrical systems, and you had incredibly maturing gas engines, material science, all sorts of stuff made the war machine, so to speak, far more advanced. And this equipment had to be operated by people who had zero training on it, and you had to get these bomber pilots up to speed. And the more you, if you did a good job, maybe they lived, and if you did a bad job, they didn't. And so it was super important. And so a whole lot of work went into both how do we train people, which was an IO psychology thing, but also how can we make the controls of a bomber more intuitive, easier to process, and then the same thing applies to everything, how guns were made, and everything else. So human factors engineering, engineering psychology was really put on the map and birthed, so to speak. It wasn't that fatigue and other stuff hadn't been looked at before, but really World War II is a thing that turned it into something people were conscious of and started becoming an explicit subdomain. So overall, World War II and dramatic use of psychologists put a lot more awareness into psychology and IO psychology, and grew the stature of IO psychology, which then went on to accelerate the adoption of IO psychology principles in government and business. And that encouraged growth in new research areas, like into what for a long time was called morale. It's still kind of called morale sometimes, but you don't hear the word morale too much in corporate America. It's usually words like engagement. A little while ago it was job satisfaction, but it's kind of the same thing. And then research into leadership. Okay, then World War II ended, and we had a baby boom, and we had economic booms. We had massive cultural upheaval. We had huge growth in research into things like how groups behave, leadership, management practices, and it's important to point out here that there's just huge overlap between many aspects of IO psychology and like business management from an academic standpoint. There are a number of people that get PhDs in IO psychology that end up in colleges of business or end up in HR departments. So the post-war economic boom, people all over the world needed American products, and we had a baby boom and consumerism popping up. A lot of things had to scale, and a lot of research went into trying to get all sciencey about it, and so whether it's from like a business school or in engineering, in human factors, or say pure IO psychology, there was just a lot of overlap in there. Okay, and then cultural changes. The women in the workplace changes in the expectations of what women's roles could be, obviously took a dramatic turn during World War II, when there was a general shortage of men in many places that at least proved that things could be done a different way. But all the cultural change that was happening at the time also meant that that door couldn't be completely closed when all the men came back from the war, so to speak. So you had a steady erosion of stereotyped roles. Barriers to entry fell. Certainly wasn't an overnight thing, but women in the workplace is it considered where a woman could enter into any job was a major sea change in our culture at the time, and similarly a civil rights era. In the birth of a number of federal and state laws around hiring and around discrimination. How you select people, how you promote people, whether you fire somebody, how do you treat people, and then now instead of it just being a decision by an organization, it was now something that had the force of law behind it, and that drove a tremendous amount of change. It is a huge structural part of the business world today. in a general, not just legal, but a cultural, an ethical awakening, so to speak, that these discriminatory practices were against the values of the culture, and that led to new selection processes that were more fair. It also led to selection processes and documentation that created a legal defense that could show in a court of law, or in the case of a lawsuit, that you were as an organization following fair procedures. And that's a huge factor today in the interview process, so selection process is making sure that you're actually documenting that you're following the law. And generally, culturally, rise of individualism, a higher expression, a general erosion of trust of established institutions, a breakdown and resetting of categories. A lot of this stuff is underway today. These things don't really go away; they sort of ebb and flow, and that's all part of this moving target for IO psychology to try to bring their tools to bear, and they have to sometimes rebend and shape their tools and resharpen them to adapt to these changes. And then the postmodern era. This is you could look at this as 1950 to the millennium, specifically around major changes that happened both in psychology and in technology. So you saw a shift in the dominant psychological frameworks from psychoanalytics, Freudian, neo-Freudianism, to behaviorism like Skinner, and then humanism emerged back from the shadows, and then the cognitive revolution happened, and you get to where we are today, where we really don't have an overarching domain, a dominant domain, so to speak, and we don't have too much antagonism across domains. But IO psychology is always sort of mining information and new findings, new frameworks from broader psychology, and the changing of what the dominant narratives were obviously affected what IO psychology was, what the cutting edge of IO psychology was. So generally speaking, in the second half of the century, explosion of knowledge and a growth in new domains in psychology. So you got new frameworks, new theoretical frameworks, new practices, new applied practices within IO psychology. Looking at group processes more, looking at motivation, looking at social interactions more. So overall, it was a growth, a maturation of the field. And then business management at the same time. I talked about the tremendous overlap between IO psychology within like a explicit psychology domain versus in the business management domain at a business college, or within like a HR department, or in business leadership. And then business management, I mean, there's a lot of things that get called fads. And really a fad is something that you only name after the fact. Before that, it's like a cutting edge new business process or product or whatever. So there's a lot of FOMO, a lot of fear of missing out. These are competitive landscapes, cutthroat in some cases. Businesses can go bankrupt, and so they're always looking for the edge, and they're always looking to adapt it. If they see it, somebody else has it. So a lot of FOMO and a lot of growth in complexity, a lot of growth in MBA programs, and generational shifts. You had the boomers taking over during this time. You had Gen X's like me starting into the workplace. And then maybe the biggest driver of change, the dawn of the digital, and the massive amount of change that just computers and everything that they touched, they tended to automate, which caused jobs to disappear and a whole bunch of jobs to appear that didn't exist before. Okay, and then the last slide would be the 21st century. Really, you had the computer revolution in the late 20th, and then that became the information revolution. It's still tons and tons of automation happening. Productivity tools. Everybody has a laptop. Lots and lots of connectivity. Email, Office suite type stuff, whether it's Google Docs or Microsoft Office. The front end of the web of all the JavaScript. The massive amount of increased productivity that came with this, and then of course all the kit and video type stuff that's productivity sinks. The internet, welcome to the internet. going to interest you in everything all of the time, everything connected. And then obviously today, you're taking this class online, losing focus. You know, you can be connected. You're literally connected to everything all the time, and anybody can reach out to various types of messaging things. And like I have like six different emails, probably more if I think about it. And so the ability to just be disconnected and to be able to focus on something deeply is kind of gone, and that's a big deal. Globalization causing all sorts of things, multicultural workplaces. Right now, we might even be in an era of deglobalization. So just constantly change. Culture keeps shifting. Social media, oh man. So social media is basically it's scaling. Social media scales social norms, you know, without scaling social ties. I mean, that's the as far as I can tell, like the reason why it's so potent and potentially so dangerous, and that we still haven't like figured out what the counterpoint is. So the norm enforcement that would happen in a village when somebody doesn't say or do something right, and the gossip that goes around some of that. The norm enforcement's a good, like, you know, generally think is a needed thing, but when you were trying to decide whether or not to ostracize somebody for a violation of norms, you also had social ties with that person or with that family member because people all knew each other. And now with social media, we have the ability to take the norm enforcement, the calling out, even the reputational destruction and the ostracism. All that's now capable at a massive scale. So we've scaled that to include everybody on the planet that wants to connect, but we haven't really done anything to scale the counterbalancing social ties. So we have this thing that only lurches in one direction and that has never existed before, as far as I can tell, and we're still trying to figure that out. And psychology is a huge part of that. I'm talking about norm enforcement and social ties. That is not all sociology. That is completely entangled in psychology, and it's a huge both opportunity and to me immediate challenge at the crisis level that psychology needs to focus on, and that IO psychology needs to look at its effect in workplace environments. All right, let's finish this up. We also have niche erosion. I mean, people work hard to get good at something, and now their job disappears, and that just seems to be accelerating. And then an emergent mental health crisis, polarization for sure, crazy polarization happening right now. And then, you know, let's just throw in a pandemic, you know, and now we've got some international conflict at play, and people are talking about famine. So the current time, you know, is not the same as like the late 60s, but there's like that time, there is a whole hell of a lot going on, and all part of the changing landscape, and IO psychology has to adapt to it. So that was the story that got us to where we are right now, to tell us what we should do in the future. Okay, so we went through the history of IO psychology. We started back in the early 20th century, focus on efficiency. We talked about World War I and how that developed in like selection tests and the alpha and beta tests. We talked about the Hawthorne studies and the Hawthorne effect, that, you know, just the process of being observed ends up having people change their own behavior. And then World War II and the birth of engineering psychology, post-war, accelerating changes to our culture in the workplace, the dawn of the digital, and then the crazy times we're in right now. Okay, and then next lecture, we are going to have our first bonus lecture, and that's going to be the human animal at work. We're going to talk about stuff like bounded embodied prediction machines. What in the hell is that? We're going to talk about approaching goals and avoiding uncertainty. We're going to talk about seeking niches. We're going to talk about the human proclivity to being absolutely horrible to outgroups. And we're going to talk about the organization or work, you know, as the environment. And then we're going to talk about everything evolves, at least everything that involves, you know, replication and competition and choice, by living beings. So it isn't just that humans and biological things evolve. It's, software evolves, technology evolves, business processes evolve, culture evolves. Okay, hope this was interesting. Looking at the time here, I went 10 minutes over the sort of expected allotted time, so I'm keeping a running toll here. So we'll have shorter lectures to make up for these longer lectures. And again, run these lectures at the speed that you find is that sort of that sweet spot. And I welcome feedback. Hopefully you guys have got a copy of the book or the ebook and are already done with reading chapter 1. Okay, we'll see you at the next lecture.